Welcome back to another episode of Opal Wave MTG, a channel dedicated to exploring power levels in EDH and helping you tune your deck to your meta. I'm your host Jacob, and today we're going to be checking out Lord Xander the Collector, 7 mana, Vampire Demon Noble, with when Lord Xander the Collector enters the battlefield, target opponent discards half the cards in their hand, rounded down. Whenever Lord Xander attacks, defending player mills half their library, rounded down. When Lord Xander dies, target opponent sacrifices half the non-land permanents they control, rounded down. And this commander has received a lot of flack ever since it was spoiled in Streets of New Capenna, and I wanted to do something a little more fun with it. So today we've got 3 group hug decks featuring Lord Xander. And group hug can be really interesting, kind of hard to balance in terms of how much removal you need, how are you actually going to win the game. So each version that I brewed here actually takes advantage of the group hug stuff and uses that to win in different ways. So it'll be really cool for us to go through those 3 different ways. As usual, the decks are in the description below. And if you want to support my channel, check out my Fiverr. It's also in the description below. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so with the Skirmish version of Lord Xander, which is our lower tier, we're just doing a lot of different types of group hugging. Primarily, we're going to be forcing our opponents to draw a lot of extra cards, and then with all those extra cards in their hand, they won't mind the first ability of Lord Xander. So you have to target opponent, they discard half the cards in their hand. Generally, people don't want to do that, but if they've drawn a bunch of cards, and you're going to let them draw even more cards, then it won't be as bad for them to discard half the cards in their hand, because you're going to refill their hand anyway. So it's, you got this nice little, you're helping them out essentially. We also have a few ways to reanimate the creatures for our opponents. Stuff like Enslave Horror. When it comes to the battlefield, each player returns a creature card from his or her graveyard to play. We've got, we've got the Patriarch's Bidding, which lets all players choose a creature type, and then all players return a creature of the chosen type to the battlefield. We've got Living Death, so we can either, if boards are getting too crazy, we can flip those over, or once, people have discarded enough cards, or if we're swinging at people with Lord Xander, we can reanimate all the creatures and put them all into the battlefield, so people don't feel as bad when you're making this card of their hand and when you're making them mill the library, because hey, you're going to give them the creatures back, right? So that's kind of makes it okay. We have a few ways for us to actually just take advantage of this, so we can kind of use this to our advantage, even though they're going to be on our opponent's side of the battlefield. So stuff like Sly Instigator, Geode Rager, Goblin Diplomats, Vengeful Ancestor, these kind of cards goad creatures our opponents control. So we're giving our opponents more creatures, and then so they don't swing at us, we're going to be using the goad mechanic to force those creatures to swing at other players. A few other cards like Duskmantle Seer and the Kami, so we can help our opponents draw more cards. Warmonger Hellkite, super cool card. All creatures attack each combat if able, and you can pay 2 mana. Attacking creatures get +1/+0 until the end of turn. Just another way for us to, force our opponents to swing and hopefully kill each other. This Sepulchral Primordial is just a way for us to get creatures from our opponent's graveyards, because at some point we do want to try and win the game. So if there's some super spicy creatures that we've milled or had someone discard, we can just take them for ourselves. Moving on to the sorceries, we've got a few cards like Stronghold Discipline, which so once we force our opponents to have a bunch of cards on the battlefield, a bunch of creatures, we can use cards like this to make them lose life for each creature they control. So we are going to enable them and then punish them for being enabled. Another card like Maestro's Confluence, where we can goad each creature target player controls. We can Mob Rule to take control of all the creatures, Insurrection to gain control of all the creatures. Again, Destructive Quorum is a sweet card, goad all creatures you don't control. And then we've also got a few ways, a few more ways to take advantage of our opponents being having full board states, like the Deadly Tempest, where we can draw a card for each creature we destroy with this card. Clone Legion, for each creature target player controls, create a token that's a copy of that creature. Super sweet card. And again, just, you know, more ways for us to take advantage and enable our opponents a little bit more. So his abilities, while they are still rude, quote unquote, it won't be as bad in the context of this deck, because we'll be giving them their stuff back. In our instance, we've got, you know, a good bit of removal. When you're playing these group hug type of decks, you really want to be able to slow the table down or stop certain things from happening. Most things you're fine with happening, and you don't want to just start countering and destroying the first thing you see come out. You want to let boards kind of build up a little bit, sit back and kind of view the board state. Don't come off as a threat, more or less. And when there's something like maybe a crater hoof that's going to come down and kill everyone, or someone's trying to combo, you can use your interaction to stop those in the key moments. But outside of that, you don't really, you know, let people be, essentially. Since we are playing that group hug, you want people to like you, more or less, so they're not swinging at you, swinging at each other. Rakdos Charm, really sweet card. Another way for us to deal damage to our opponents based on how many creatures they have. And Illusionist Gambit, which is kind of like a Disrupt Decorum, but not really. So you can only cast it during the declare blocker step of an opponent's turn, and then you remove all attacking creatures from combat and untap them. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase. Each of those creatures attacks that turn, that combat if able. They can't attack you or planeswalkers you control. So essentially, this is an instant speed goad spell, and it can only be done during the declare blockers step of an opponent's turn. So if they're swinging at someone else, you want to just kind of let it go. But if people are swinging at you, this is a great way to stop people from swinging at you specifically, because during the declare blocker step, you cast this card and it removes all the attacking creatures from combat. So a really great way for us to protect ourselves and use those creatures against our opponents. And the artifacts, we got a few ways, like Bloodthirsty Blade, that will goad a creature. Victory Chime, so we can tempt players by giving them mana potentially. Curse Mirror is a sweet way for us to make a copy of a really sweet creature that an opponent has resolved or we forced onto the battlefield. Howling Mine, an extra way for our opponents to draw cards. And then everything else is pretty much just simple, you know, straightforward ramp spells. Got some 2-drops, we got the Soul Ring, we got some 3-drops in here. We're not doing anything crazy. And the enchantments, we've got the Shiny Impetus to go to creature and produce a treasure token. Mirror Mockery is actually a really interesting one. So if, you know, we give our opponents a really nice creature, and then whenever they attack with that creature, we get a token and we put it in the battlefield. So if someone's got a sweet, you know, ETB creature, you know, we can put this on it and we get those ETB triggers whenever it attacks. And we have a few ways to force combat, so that's really nice. Or, you know, it just deters people from swinging at us specifically. If it's a 6/6 or a 5/5 or, you know, whatever, if it's power, toughness are equal, or if it's got power more than its toughness, Mirror Mockery is a great way for us to kill that creature if they decide to swing at us, because we can just block it. Frenzied Fugue is another way for us to gain control of a permanent. This enchants any permanent, so it's really cool. And you gain it until the end of turn or at the beginning of your upkeep. So the other opponent still gets their permanent, but you get the permanent too on your turn. So, you know, not bad. They still get the stuff. They can have it. That's fine. But we want it to sometimes. Well of Ideas, another way for us to get more card advantage and fill up our opponent's hands. Rite of the Raging Storm gives everyone an elemental rage elemental that can swing at everybody except for you. Super sweet. Price of Knowledge, a way to punish our opponents for having too many cards in their hands, so players have no max hand size, and at the beginning of each upkeep, Price of Knowledge deals damage to the player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. So this card can eventually kill people. Pretty sweet. Propaganda, just a way for us to deter players from swinging at us in case we don't have our goad going. And a Forced Fruition, whenever an opponent plays a spell, that player draws 7 cards. So this card is hilarious because, well, your opponents are going to draw a lot of cards, and if you can get out a Price of Knowledge at the same time, they won't have a maximum hand size, and then, you know, all the spells are going to essentially just be shooting themselves for 7 every turn with the Price of Knowledge. Or, you know, eventually with Lord Xander, if you swing at players a few times with Lord Xander, and you've milled their deck a couple of times, this is a really great way for people to just mill themselves out. If they don't have a Thassa's Oracle or some kind of lab man type effect to actually win off of this, it's really great. It's a pretty sweet finisher actually. And if they're trying to win while they're getting all these cards, we'll have our counter manager removal ready to get rid of any of the key pieces that our opponents are using to win the game, so they can't win the game. Moving on to the lands, nothing crazy here. A few dual lands and stuff just to make sure we're hitting our colors, playing nice and slow over here. Nothing too crazy. We got Mirror Landscape to get us ramping a little bit, but outside of that, it's just chilling. Nice, cheap, easy to make mana base. And moving on to the battle version of Xander, we're gonna take advantage of our group hug a little bit differently by turns. So we're going to get a bunch of our draw type effects out, and then once we've got a few extra draw pieces going, we can start chaining our turns. And we don't have any infinite combos as far as our turns go, but we do have a few ways to Notion Thief, or Narset, where we can shut off our opponent's hands and swing at our opponents a few times with Lord Xander to get their library nice and low, and hopefully mill out some players that way. Jason's Archivist, Magus of the Wheel can force our opponents to draw cards, potentially if we don't have our Notion Thief or our Narset out. Again, we've got the Kami in here. We've got Carter. Doom Scourge is a one-off, kind of force everyone to swing if boards really are getting crazy. We've got Teferi, Mage of Zhalfir, and a Tidal Barracuda. Both of these cards stop opponents from interacting with us during our turns, and since we want to be taking multiple turns in a row, these two cards are going to be really great from stopping opponents from interacting with us. So Teferi says creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield have flash. Each opponent can cast spells only anytime they could cast a sorcery. So they can interact on their opponent's turns, and they can interact specifically on our turn. And then obviously this has flash, so you can flash this bad boy in at the end step right before we want to start chaining a few turns together. Tidal Barracuda more or less does the opposite in an interesting way. Your opponents can't cast spells during your turn, and then any player may cast spells as though they had flash. So everyone can do everything during their own, each other's turns, but during our turn, nothing can happen. So, a few things can happen. There, you can activate abilities or Seiju or what have you, but you can't cast spells. So it makes it really hard for people to interact with us since we want to take multiple turns in a row. And an Undead Alchemist. This card is very interesting. So if a zombie you control would deal combat damage to a player, instead that player mills that many cards. Whenever a creature card is put into an opponent's graveyard from their library, exile that card and create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. And with Lord Xander, we get to mill half of a player's library when we swing. So we get this guy out, we start taking our extra turns, and we start amassing this massive horde of zombies. And another way that we can take advantage of this Undead Alchemist is with the Altar of the Brood. So Altar of the Brood, whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. And this isn't an infinite combo, it's very deterministic. It's determined based on how many creatures your opponents have in their decks. But if you mill one player for one card and it happens to be a zombie, each opponent is going to mill one more card. And as long as you hit one more creature within the top card of each of your opponent's libraries, you're going to exile that card and make another zombie, which will then trigger the Altar of the Brood again. And if you hit two creatures in your opponent's decks, then you get two more triggers. And it could add up and potentially mill out players. Again, this is completely dependent on how many creatures your opponents have in their libraries. But if we get these two cards out and we swing at someone with Lord Xander and we mill half their deck, we're going to get a lot of Undead Alchemist triggers just off of the bat, right? So, even if we mill I don't know, 15 cards, it's still 15 Undead Alchemist triggers, and each of those triggers can potentially produce more triggers. So it's a really sweet way for us to mill out our opponents and amass this massive horde of zombies that we can use to end the game and mill our opponents out. And the sorceries, we've got a bunch of extra turn spells. Alrund's Epiphany, Beacon of Tomorrow, Karn's Temporal Sundering, Temporal Trespass. I mean, just a bunch of them. And again, we're not trying to like do infinite turns necessarily, but it's gonna feel like that once we get our chain going, because we're gonna be using cards like Kami of the Crescent Moon to draw more cards on each of our turns. Use these guys that can wheel so we can find even more turns. And once you get one turn going and you have the setup needed, it's going to be a good time. You're going to have a lot of turns. We've got the Blasphemous Act, a Damnation, Vandal Blast, so we can kind of just sweep the board of opponents' creatures if they've built up their boards too big, or if everyone's got a lot of rocks out, we can use the Vandal Blast, and a Peer into the Abyss. And so this is going to be a really interesting one. If we can peer into the abyss, a player, and we could peer into the abyss yourself if you have that many cards that you want to draw, or you can like use your Jace or whatever. But you can peer into the abyss someone, and then you can like Jace's Archivist, or you could cast your Lord Xander, and you could have a player discard half the cards that they drew. So if they're drawing, I don't know, 40 cards, you make them discard 20 cards. And then we've got the Liliana's Caress and a Megrim, so whenever an opponent discards a card, deals 2 damage to that player, or they lose 2 life. So potentially if we force a player to draw a bunch of cards off Peer, and then we cast our Lord Xander, make them discard all those cards, force them to discard them, or just let them move to their end step and hope they don't have a way to remove either one of these cards, and they're just gonna die. So not bad. Peer into the Abyss, pretty funny one. Plus they lose half their life when that happens. Few more, kind of just upgraded our instant package a little bit here. I'm a big fan of a Braid. I think it's really good. Cyclonic Rift, so we can bounce everything before we wheel, since that's just going to be a really great way for us to reset. Sudden Spoiling, split second. All creatures lose all abilities and have power and toughness 0-2. And just like I said, a few more ways to upgrade our interaction package. Elusive's Gambit is still in here, and a Nexus of Fate as another extra turn spell. And the artifacts, we got the Altar of the Brood in here still, and we've upgraded our rocks to primarily 2 drops, with the Curse Mirror still being the deck since we can copy an opponent's card, and the Soul Ring obviously on 1 mana, and a Wishclaw Talisman, so we can tutor up a card and then we can give it to an opponent so they can potentially tutor up something. If you want to do kind of make a deal with someone or whatever and give them the Wishclaw Talisman. And with the enchantments, we've got Dictative Crewfix, Kumina's Awakening, Teferi's Ageless Insight, Well of Ideas. These are all cards that we want to slam on the battlefield so we can start drawing extra cards. And essentially, once we're drawing those cards and we got the extra turns going, we're going to be the only one that's actually benefiting off of these cards anymore, because we're going to be the only one with turns. And a Force Fruition is still in the deck. I think this card's hilarious, especially with the Liliana's Crest and the Megrim. If they don't have a way to make their hand size infinite, they're gonna kill themselves essentially very quickly. And we still got the Propaganda to stop opponents from swinging at us in the early game, since we are playing kind of a control lead deck, and it's gonna take a minute before we actually get our turns going, right? So we want to be able to slow that board down just a little bit. And Flood of Tears, I didn't really talk about this one, but this one's really sweet. We bounce everything, and then if we bounce 4 or more, we can put a permanent from our hand into the battlefield. So if we bounce our Lord Xander, we can just put it back in the battlefield. And then the person who had the scariest board state, we can have them, discard half their hand, which is pretty sweet, depending on, how many cards they actually put in from the battlefield. And the lands, just some pretty straightforward upgrades. Some more untapped lands. We got the Shocks in here. Nothing too crazy. Like the if you control 2 or more lands, we got those. We added a Xander's Lounge for that flavor. just hits all of our colors anyway. But yeah, pretty straightforward. More of our lands are entering untapped, so once we get our chain going with the infinite turns, it's going to be easier for us to follow that up with either more turns or like do a turn plus another spell, so we can actually start to gain more advantage off of those turns that we're casting previously. Before I move on to the glory version of Lord Xander, if you've enjoyed this content and you want to see more of it, go ahead and like, subscribe, and leave a comment below letting me know what commander you'd like to see next. And with the glory version of Xander, which is essentially cEDH, I took a lot of inspiration from Opus Thief. And if you aren't aware of what Opus Thief is a 4-color deck. It's Grixis plus white that wants to wheel players and then gain advantage off of that wheel, whether through a Narset or a Notion Thief, essentially using our wheels as win cons. So this deck is more focused on wheels and abusing those wheels and taking advantage of those wheels so we gain the benefit from them. So we've got Jace and a Narset. Narset is a great way to actually stop our opponents from drawing all those cards like we did in the previous version. And a Jace, so we can win the game off of a Tainted Pact or a Demonic Consultation. Same thing with our Thassa's Oracle. Even though it is a quote-unquote group hug deck, we're trying to win as efficiently as possible still. Whether or not we can actually get our main game plan going, that's not as important. With the other creatures, we've got Dothy Voidwalker, Dockside Extortionist, extremely powerful, Gilded Jade, just some of the the staples that we see. Malevolent Hermit I think is really sweet in this deck, especially since we want our wheels to resolve, and this just makes it really hard for our opponents to interact with our wheels with the opposite side of this card, since our non-creature spells can't be countered. Oppo Agent, since we are kind of a slower, more control-y type of deck, Opposition Agent's going to fit really well in here. Got the Simian Spirit Guide, so we can fire off those wheels, those turn 1, maybe turn 2 wheels off a little bit, more consistently. Surly Badgesaur. So this is a sweet card. If we discard cards, we gain some kind of advantage. So if you discard a creature, it gets +1/+1. Not that big of a deal. If you discard a land, you get a treasure token. So that's super sweet, especially if you want to chain a few wheels together in a row. And whenever you discard a non-creature, non-land card, Surly Badgesaur fights up to one target creature you don't control. So if you are discarding a few creatures and then you discard some non-creatures with this card out, you can make them bigger and fight some of the smaller dorks at the table. And yeah, it's going to be really good. Turgid, God of Fright, probably not the most efficient card in the deck, but it's funny if you get this out and then resolve a few wheels. Whenever opponent discards a permanent or sacrifices a permanent, you're going to get that permanent onto your battlefield, so you can mill a Dockside or whatever and get that card. It can be pretty sweet. And Dothy actually has some pretty sweet tech with Lord Xander in general. If you mill half of someone's library, you're going to get all those cards exiled under a Dothy Voidwalker, which could get kind of crazy. Or even just when Lord Xander enters and target opponent discards half their hand, you're going to get half their hand under a Dothy Voidwalker. In general, it's kind of hard to utilize Xander's abilities in the context of cEDH. And if you've noticed, I'm not doing any of the Deadeye Navigator type of combos, because it's, in my opinion, it's a little overdone, and making all of our opponents discard down to 1 as one of our main combos, it just doesn't seem worth it, especially since we can just do that with a Narset Partner Veils plus a wheel. It's just, in the context of cEDH, it's just not going to be doing that much for you as the player. It should also be noted with Notion Thief that if you wheel a few times with this guy out, you could potentially just draw your entire deck. So if you have Notion Thief out and you cast the Wheel of Fortune, you're going to draw 28 cards, because you're going to draw 7, and then because they're not drawing during their draw steps, you're going to draw all 7 of those cards as well. So 21 from your opponent, 7 times 3, plus your own 7 is going to be 28. And then if you cast a Windfall, so each player discards their hand and then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. So you discard 28 cards, and now each player has to draw 28 cards. So with Notion Thief, you're gonna draw your entire deck. If you have a Jace, Wielder of Mysteries out, you are just gonna win the game. So another interesting path to victory with the Notion Thief specifically. In our sorceries, we got a few more we got a little bit of ritual with the Rite of Flame and a Jeska's Will, and then a bunch of ways to force our opponents to draw cards so we can take advantage of our Notion Thief or the Narset Partner of Veils. These cards are going to be great. Burning Inquiry, they won't draw those cards and then they just discard 3 cards at random. Dark Deal, each player discards a card in their hand and then draws that many cards -1. We've got the Time Twister, Wheel of Fortune, Whispering Madness, a bunch of these cards that are going to wheel our opponents. You can reanimate so we can steal something from our opponent's graveyard, maybe a Dockside or what have you. Then we've got the Mnemonic Betrayal, super sweet card in this deck. So as we're wheeling our opponents, we'll eventually, they'll have so many cards in their graveyard that you can use. You can just cast a Mnemonic Betrayal and one off of your opponent's graveyard. Whether, you're assembling some part, like if you have the Thassa's and they've got a Demonic Consultation in your graveyard, you can just steal that. Or if they've got, both Thassa's and a Demonic Consultation in their graveyard, you can steal that. Maybe they've got an Underworld Breach in their graveyard and you want to set up a Brain Freeze combo, you can do that. There's a lot of different ways to, assemble your own combos or just completely steal a combo with the Mnemonic Betrayal, especially with Xander, like being able to swing at a player, mill half of their deck, and then, Mnemonic Betrayal after that to just it's a super sweet way to actually leverage Lord Xander's ability in the context of cEDH, so it's really sweet. Moving on to the instance, we got Adnan's way to draw a bunch of cards so we can try a win attempt off of that. We got Brain Freeze for our Brain Freeze combo. We've got the Lion's Eye, Lotus Petal plus Underworld Breach, so we can either mill ourselves out and win with the Thassa's Oracle, or we can just target our opponent with all of the extra Brain Freeze copies that we have and mill them out to win the game. We've got a few rituals to help us power out our wheels in the early game, and then just a bunch of removal so we can stop our opponents from winning. We got our Tainted Pact as well as the Demonic Consultation to obviously win the game. And we've got just the one Red Elemental Blast in here, so counter target red spell being cast or destroy a blue permanent in play. And the reason why I'm not running Pyroblast is because we just have a bunch of interaction in the deck already. I didn't have room for both of them. So if you're only gonna run one, just do Red Elemental Blast. And the main difference between the two is Pyroblast says to counter a spell if it is blue, or destroy a target permanent if it is blue. So with Red Blast, if you Red Blast a blue spell and then they try to Deflecting Swat your Red Blast, they cannot change the target of Red Blast to Deflecting Swat because it is not a legal target. And then if you also notice that we don't have a Fierce Guardianship or our own Deflecting Swat, and that's because Xander is just so expensive, it's going to be hard for us to actually utilize that in the early game where it actually matters. So don't really want that card to be dead in our hand, or force us to actually cast it for 3. Imagine casting that spell for 3. I couldn't. But with Lord Xander, it's going to be a little bit harder for us to actually cast it for free. So we're not going to run either of those cards because they just aren't as good in this context. We've got our Intuition to set up our combos, as well as Limdal's Fault, super strong card. And moving on to our artifacts, we've definitely upgraded our artifacts. It's super important in a deck like this that we are wheeling either in two different instances we want to be wheeling. The first one is if we have one of our payoffs, like Notion Thief or a Narset out. And the other time we want to wheel is in the really early stages of the game. Like turn 1 is ideal, and turn 2 maybe if our opponents haven't advanced their board that much, and that's so we can take advantage of this effect as much as possible and not give our opponents more cards so they can actually win. In cEDH, win cons are really they're condensed, they're easy to pull off. So if we're wheeling in like turn 3 or we don't have a way to actually stop our opponents from drawing those extra cards, it's not going to be a good time for us. You're more or less just enabling the table. So playing how you play this deck really matters when you're casting your wheels. It's all about context. But the two main things is in the early game, or when you have one of your anti-draw pieces out, one of your ways to take advantage of the wheel. And so having this fast mana in here is going to be really important for us to get the wheels out fast, or to cast one of our payoffs a little bit faster. And we've also got a Wishclaw Talisman, so we can tutor. It's a really great tutor, especially if we've got if we tutor for opposition agent first and then we give it to an opponent. We can just basically take any card from our opponent's deck, so that's super sweet. It should be noted that Wishclaw Talisman can be activated at instant speed, but it can only be activated during your turn. People are aware of it, but not too many people that don't actively play this card know that. So just make sure that your opponent doesn't try to bait you out by going for a fetch land first to draw out that opposition agent so they can Wishclaw in response to that. Just something to keep in mind when you are using the Wishclaw Talisman in that context. Then we've got our Mystic Remora and the Rhystic Study to gain some card advantage if we can't find that early wheel. Necropotence, also an amazing card for us to gain card advantage. And Underworld Breach and the Waste Knot as another way for us to gain card advantage. In the lands, we've got our Ancient Tomb, Gemstone Caverns, make ourselves accelerate a little bit faster. Urza Saga is really great for finding some of those, those fast mana pieces that we really want to have. And then the rest of the mana base is a Tainted Pact mana base. We've gone over this mana base a lot on this channel. Since we are on the Tainted Pact, we want to be able to, make sure that it's going to exile our whole library so we can win with the Thassa's Oracle or the Jace, Wielder of Secrets. And from there, the rest of our lands are all entering untapped, and, they're all just really strong lands. Otawara is also really great. Not as great since we don't get the reduced 1 without Lord Xander being out, which is, not going to be happening every game with this deck, but it's still just free real estate and can function as removal in a pinch. Thanks again for checking out this episode of Opal Wave MTG. I'm your host Jacob, and again, if you want to help support this channel, be sure to check out my Fiverr. Got that in the description below. And until next time, see you later.